know that moment when you're speaking and someone cuts you off, like your words don't even matter. It's not just about being interrupted. It's that sting underneath, the quiet message that says, you're not important enough to be heard. And maybe you just let it slide, smile, nod, and shrink back because calling it out feels too heavy, too confrontational. But inside, it chips away at you. This isn't just about one conversation. It's about respect, about your voice carrying weight in the spaces you step into. Because when you're constantly talked over, you start to believe the lie that what you have to say isn't worth finishing. And that's where the real damage begins. When someone talks over you, it doesn't just interrupt your sentence. It interrupts your sense of worth in that moment. You're left holding your thoughts, wondering if it's even worth finishing, questioning if they'll ever really listen. And that can build over time, especially in relationships that already feel fragile. It's confusing because you don't want to make it a bigger deal than it is, but you also don't want to keep shrinking back. This is the tension so many people live with quietly. The need to be heard without turning every conversation into a fight. That's what we're going to walk through today. How to hold your ground with calm, with respect, and without losing yourself in the process. Finding your voice when respect feels missing starts with naming the truth of what's really going on. Because when someone talks over you, dismisses your words, or leaves you hanging in the middle of a thought, it's not just about the words themselves. It's about the message underneath. You don't matter as much as I do right now. And that message, whether it's spoken or unspoken, hits deeper than we like to admit. For some of us, it stirs up frustration and anger, and for others, it makes us go quiet and pull back. Either way, it creates distance. And what often gets lost in the moment is not just your sentence, it's your sense of worth, your sense of having a place in the relationship. It's easy to brush this off and say, that's just how they are, or I don't want to make a big deal out of it. But deep down, it is a big deal because when respect feels missing, silence starts to grow where connection should be. You stop saying the little things because you don't think they'll be received. You hold back the bigger things because you don't trust they'll be handled with care. And soon, it's not just about being interrupted, it's about not being known. That's the deeper issue. It's not about a single conversation, it's about the erosion of trust that comes when your voice doesn't find space. Now, here's the hard part. We often wait for the other person to notice, to change, to finally realize how their behavior makes us feel. But if we're honest, most of the time, they don't. Not because they're incapable, but because they're not tuned into the same frequency you are. They might not see your silence as hurt. They might not notice that you stopped talking because you feel dismissed. They just see a quieter version of you and assume nothing's wrong. That's why finding your voice matters. Not because you need to win every conversation, but because your voice is how you protect the respect that should exist between you and the people in your life. Finding your voice doesn't mean shouting over someone or forcing your words through. That's not strength. That's just another version of the problem. Real strength is calm, steady, and confident. It looks like finishing your thought without apologizing for taking up space. It looks like saying, hold on, I wasn't finished, with composure instead of aggression. It looks like letting your words land, even if the other person doesn't receive them perfectly. Because here's the truth, your voice isn't just about communication, it's about self-respect. When you use it, you're reminding yourself that what you have to say matters. And that's where a lot of us get stuck, because there's a fear underneath it all. The fear that if I speak up, it'll cause conflict. If I stand my ground, it'll make things worse. And maybe you've been in environments before where that fear was true. Maybe you grew up in a home where speaking your mind led to punishment, or you were in a relationship where honesty turned into a fight. So now, even in situations where it might be safe to speak, you've learned to swallow your words. That fear makes sense, but it also keeps you trapped in a cycle where respect keeps slipping further away. The way out isn't about changing who the other person is. It's about choosing who you will be in that moment. Will you be the one who disappears, who quietly absorbs the message that you don't matter? Or will you be the one who holds steady, who calmly makes space for yourself without losing kindness in the process? Finding your voice when respect feels missing isn't just about others treating you better. It's about you treating yourself better. It's about showing yourself that you deserve to be heard, even if the other person isn't ready to listen. Think about the relationships in your life where this shows up the most. Maybe it's with a partner who doesn't let you finish your thoughts. Maybe it's at work in a meeting where louder voices dominate. Maybe it's with a friend who always turns the conversation back to themselves. Each of those moments feels small, but they stack up. And if you don't practice using your voice in the small moments, the big ones will feel impossible. That's why the practice starts with simple, steady steps. Instead of shrinking back, try pausing, taking a breath, and saying, "I'd like to finish what I was saying." It's not flashy, but it's powerful, because it's you standing up for your voice without stepping on anyone else's. Respect in relationships doesn't just happen. It's built, it's reinforced, and sometimes it has to be repaired. And part of that repair comes from you modeling the very thing you want. If you want your voice respected, you have to first respect it yourself. That means not downplaying your thoughts, not rushing through your sentences, not apologizing for existing in the space. It also means offering respect back, listening fully when others speak, giving the same presence you're asking for. That reciprocity is what builds stronger connection. But it starts with you. There will be times when you find your voice and the other person still doesn't respond the way you hoped. They might still interrupt. They might still dismiss. And in those moments, you'll be tempted to believe it's not worth trying. But every time you use your voice, you're making an investment, not just in the relationship, but in yourself. You're building the muscle of self-respect, of calm strength, of showing up fully even when it's uncomfortable. And over time, that changes the way people see you, because people tend to treat us in line with how we treat ourselves. So finding your voice when respect feels missing isn't about proving someone else wrong. It's about proving to yourself that you're worth being heard. It's about refusing to shrink down into silence when your words could bring connection, clarity, or even healing. And it's about carrying yourself with enough calm confidence that even if the respect doesn't come from them, it's still present in you. That's how you begin to change, not just the conversation, but the whole relationship dynamic. And here's the thing, you don't have to do it perfectly. You don't have to nail the exact words every time. What matters is that you take the step. You speak up once when you would have stayed quiet before. You finish one thought instead of backing away. You try again, even after the first attempt didn't go as planned. That's what growth looks like. Not perfection, practice. Each time you use your voice, you're building trust with yourself. And when that trust grows, respect follows. Because at the end of the day, your voice matters. Not because it's louder than anyone else's, not because it demands the room, but because it's yours. And when you honor it, you start to draw the kind of respect you've been missing, not just from others, but from yourself. When communication breaks down, it's rarely about the words alone. It's about the weight behind them, the tone, the timing, the way it lands on the other person. You know those moments where you feel like you're speaking two different languages, where no matter how clearly you think you're saying it, they just aren't hearing you. Or worse, they hear something completely different than what you meant. That's the moment where frustration creeps in and patience starts to wear thin. And if you're not careful, that frustration grows into anger or it pushes you into silence. Either way, the conversation you needed to have never really happens. Staying calm in those moments feels impossible sometimes. Because when you care about being understood, every misunderstanding feels personal. You want to defend yourself, correct the record, make them see it from your side. But the harder you push, the more walls go up. And suddenly you're not just talking about the issue anymore. You're arguing about the way you're arguing. That's how breakdown happens. It shifts the focus from connection to conflict, from listening to winning. And if you've ever walked away from a conversation exhausted, confused, or even more distant than when you started, you know how heavy that cycle can feel. Here's the truth, most of us don't admit. The hardest part of communication isn't finding the right words, it's managing yourself when the other person doesn't respond the way you hoped. Calm isn't something you wait for them to create. Calm is something you carry in with you. And that matters because your calm is contagious. When you stay grounded, it makes space for the other person to come down from their own defensiveness. But if you match their energy, if you raise your voice because they raise theirs, if you cut them off because they cut you off, then you've already lost the part of yourself that could have turned things around. Think about it. The last time a conversation went sideways, what was really happening inside you? Maybe your chest tightened, your jaw clenched, your thoughts raced with comebacks. That's your body signaling that it's slipping into defense mode. You're no longer present, you're protecting yourself. And in that mode, listening becomes almost impossible. We hear only enough to argue back. We wait for a pause not to understand, but to jump in. And that's not communication, that's combat dressed up as conversation. So what does staying calm actually look like? It's not sitting there emotionless. It's not pretending you don't care. Staying calm is choosing steadiness when everything in you wants to react. It's noticing the rise in your voice and bringing it back down. It's slowing your breathing when your heart wants to race. It's pausing before responding so your words don't come from the place of heat, but from the place of clarity. And most importantly, it's remembering that staying calm doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger. Because calm is what keeps you in control of yourself, and that's the only control you really have in the moment. One of the biggest misconceptions we carry is thinking that communication has to be fixed right here, right now. That urgency is what breaks us down. We want resolution in the heat of the moment, but that's the worst time to demand it. Calm allows you to say, I need a moment before I respond, without guilt. It allows you to step away to gather yourself instead of fueling the fire, and it allows you to come back with a clear head, where your words can actually land the way you mean them to. That kind of pause isn't avoidance, it's wisdom. It's the discipline to protect the relationship from the damage that comes when emotions run unchecked. And I know part of you might think, if I step back, won't that look like I don't care? But the opposite is true. It shows you care enough not to let your anger do the talking. It shows you care enough to protect the relationship instead of proving a point. Calm is not the absence of passion. Calm is passion under control, and people feel that. They can sense when your words are steady instead of sharp. They can sense when your presence is grounding instead of fueling the chaos. That's why staying calm doesn't just change the moment, it changes the tone of the entire relationship over time. Another piece of this is learning not to take everything personally. Easier said than done, right? But so much of communication breakdown isn't really about you. It's about the stress the other person is carrying, the assumptions they're making, the unspoken fears or frustrations they don't know how to put into words. When you can step back and say, this reaction isn't about my worth, it's about their struggle, you give yourself room to stay steady. You don't have to absorb every sharp word as truth. You don't have to let their tone dictate your peace. Calm grows when you separate your identity from the intensity of the moment. And let's be honest, we've all been on the other side too. We've all been the one whose words came out too harsh, who didn't listen fully, who let emotions spill out as defensiveness. Remembering that helps keep compassion alive, because communication isn't a scoreboard. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about whether we're willing to slow down enough to actually hear each other. Calm is what makes that possible. So the next time you feel a conversation slipping into chaos, start small. Notice your tone before you notice theirs. Breathe before you speak. Remind yourself that listening doesn't mean agreeing, and staying calm doesn't mean surrendering. It just means you're choosing to lead yourself well in the moment. And when you do that consistently, something powerful shifts. You stop being at the mercy of every emotional storm, and you start becoming the steady presence that anchors the conversation back to what matters. Because at the end of the day, communication will break down. It's part of being human. But what defines the health of a relationship isn't whether miscommunication happens. It's how we respond when it does. If you can stay calm, you give the relationship a chance to recover, to reset, to rebuild trust. And more importantly, you give yourself the peace of knowing that no matter how the other person shows up, you don't have to lose yourself in the process. Calm is your power. Calm is your authority. Calm is what keeps you grounded when words are flying and emotions are high. And the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. So when communication breaks down, and you'll know how to hold steady, not just for them, but for you. Because your peace is worth protecting, even in the middle of the hardest conversations. Holding space for yourself without starting a fight is one of the hardest balances to strike in any relationship. Because most of us were taught, either directly or indirectly, that we have two choices when conflict shows up. We either stay quiet to keep the peace, or we push back hard and brace for the fallout. But there's another way, a quieter, steadier way that allows you to protect your voice without tearing down the relationship in the process. It begins with learning that holding space for yourself isn't selfish, and it isn't aggressive. It's the act of respecting your needs enough to let them be seen, while respecting the other person enough to bring them forward with calm and care. Think about the moments when this tension shows up. You're in a conversation where something cuts against you. Maybe it's a dismissive comment, a sharp tone, or the feeling that your perspective was overlooked. Inside, there's this pull. Part of you wants to speak up, part of you wants to swallow it down. You don't want to start an argument, but you also don't want to keep carrying the weight of silence. And here's the truth. Every time you silence yourself, a little piece of the relationship shifts, because your silence doesn't just disappear, it lingers. It turns into distance, into resentment, into the sense that you're not fully yourself around them. That's the cost of not holding space for yourself. But here's the other side. When we do try to hold space, it often comes out of frustration. We wait until we've stuffed it down long enough that it bursts out sharp and raw. The tone is edgy, the words are loaded, and before we know it, we're in the very fight we were trying to avoid. This is why so many people think there are only two options, silence or conflict. But both extremes come from the same place, not giving ourselves permission to speak calmly, clearly, and consistently in the moment. So what does holding space for yourself really look like? It looks like slowing the conversation down when you feel yourself speeding up. It looks like saying, I need to pause and finish what I was saying without raising your voice. It looks like calmly stating your perspective, even if the other person doesn't agree. Because your worth isn't measured by their agreement. It's the courage to remain steady when your instinct is to either explode or retreat. That steadiness is what transforms the moment. Because when your voice is calm, it gives the other person less to push against and more to listen to. Holding space for yourself also means being clear on what you're protecting. Sometimes we think we're defending ourselves when really we're defending our ego. There's a difference between speaking from hurt pride and speaking from genuine need. If the goal is to be heard, not to win, then the way you show up changes. You're not trying to overpower. You're not trying to silence them back. You're simply taking up the space that every person deserves in a healthy conversation. That shift in intention from proving a point to protecting your peace is what makes your words land differently. A big part of this is tone. Words matter, but tone carries them. You can say the right thing with the wrong tone, and it will never be received the way you intend. That's why calm matters so much. When your tone is even, when your body language is steady, you're signaling safety even as you assert yourself. You're showing the other person, I'm not here to fight you, but that kind of presence is hard to argue with. It disarms defensiveness because you're not matching the chaos. You're setting a new rhythm. And let's be honest, sometimes the other person still won't receive it well. They may interrupt, dismiss, or roll their eyes. That's when the real challenge shows up. Because in that moment, you'll feel the pull to either escalate or shut down. But holding space for yourself means resisting both. It means staying in that calm, clear lane even when they try to drag you out of it. It's reminding yourself, I don't have to fight to be heard, and I don't have to disappear either. That middle ground is where real strength lies. In real life, this might sound like, I hear what you're saying, but I'd like to finish my thought before we move on. Or, I need to take a step back and share how this is landing for me. These aren't weapons. They're boundaries spoken with clarity. And the more you practice them, the less pressure builds up inside you. You don't have to wait for the perfect moment to speak. You create it by calmly stepping into the conversation when it matters, Another layer to this is self-trust. A lot of people don't hold space for themselves because they don't trust their own voice. Maybe they grew up in environments where their words were dismissed. Maybe past relationships taught them that speaking up leads to rejection or conflict. Over time, they learned that silence feels safer. But safe isn't the same as healthy. Silence keeps the peace on the surface while unrest grows underneath. Trusting your voice again takes practice. It starts with small steps, speaking up in low-stakes moments, finishing your thoughts without apologizing, stating your feelings without wrapping them in disclaimers. Each time you do, you're telling yourself, my words matter. My presence matters. I matter? Holding space for yourself without starting a fight is also about timing. Not every moment is the right moment. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is say, I'd like to talk about this later when we're both calmer. That's not avoiding. That's choosing the right environment for your words to land. Because your voice deserves not just to be spoken, but to be heard. And sometimes being heard means waiting for the soil to be ready, not just throwing your words on rocky ground. It's also about reciprocity. If you expect others to give you space, you have to practice giving it too. That means listening fully even when you disagree. It means letting them finish without planning your rebuttal. Respect flows both ways. And the more you model it, the more you set the tone for how conversations can go. You can't control whether they follow, but you can control the standard you uphold. At the heart of it all, holding space for yourself without starting a fight is really about dignity. It's saying, I am allowed to be here. I am allowed to take up space in this conversation. I am allowed to exist fully without crushing anyone else in the process. That's not pride. That's self-respect. And when you carry that quietly but firmly, the people around you notice. Over time, they may rise to meet you there. But even if they don't, you'll know you've done the work to protect your own voice. Because at the end of the day, fights don't always come from what's said. They often come from how it's said, and from whether the other person feels heard. By holding space for yourself with calm and clarity, you lower the temperature. You make room for both voices to exist, and you remind yourself that peace isn't found by disappearing, and respect isn't gained by shouting. It's built in the steady, everyday practice of showing up with both strength and grace. Your voice matters, your presence matters. And when you learn to hold space for yourself without starting a fight, you stop living in the extremes of silence or conflict. You start living in the middle ground where connection can actually grow. That's not just good communication. That's healthy relationship. And it starts with the choice in each moment to calmly say, I belong here too. Interruptions are one of those things that can catch us off guard. You're in the middle of a sentence. Your thought is finally starting to take shape, and suddenly someone jumps in. It can feel like the air gets sucked right out of the room. In that moment, it's easy to take it personally, like they don't value what you're saying, or worse, like you don't matter enough to be heard. And because of that, interruptions don't just stop your words. They stop your flow, your confidence, and sometimes even your willingness to try again. That's why so many of us either go quiet when it happens, or we snap back in frustration. Both of those reactions make sense, but neither actually gets us what we're really after, which is to be heard and understood. What most people miss is that interruptions don't have to end the conversation. They can actually become turning points. Because when someone cuts in, it gives you a choice. You can let it derail you, or you can use it to create more clarity around what you're trying to say. That's not easy, especially when emotions are high, but the way you handle an interruption says a lot about how much authority you carry over yourself. If you can stay calm, steady, and present, you turn a moment of frustration into a chance to guide the conversation back to where it needs to go. Now, let's talk about the real issue underneath. Interruption is rarely just about talking over someone. It's about control, power, or assumptions. Sometimes people interrupt because they're excited and can't hold their thought in. Other times, it's because they believe they already know where you're going, so they cut in early. And in some cases, it's a pattern. They've learned that their voice takes priority, and yours will wait. Each one of those scenarios hits differently. But in every one of them, the deeper issue is respect. Do they see your voice as worth the space it takes? Do they trust that your words deserve to finish? That's That's why it stings. Not because of the noise, but because of the message it sends. But here's where the shift comes. You can't always stop people from interrupting you, but you can decide how you respond. And the response you choose can either escalate tension or invite clarity. For example, if someone cuts you off mid-sentence, you might feel the urge to raise your voice, talk faster, or shut down completely. But another option is to calmly pause, let them finish, and then say, "I want to go back and finish what I was saying." That's not defensive, it's directive. It tells the room, "I'm not disappearing, but I'm also not fighting you for space." That calm redirection creates clarity, not just for them, but for you. It reminds you that your words are still worth finishing. Turning interruptions into opportunities also means checking your assumptions. Sometimes an interruption feels like disrespect, but it might just be mistiming. The other person could be eager, nervous, or unaware of how they're coming across. If you lead with immediate defensiveness, you miss the chance to sort that out. But if you stay calm and steady, you can address it in a way that clears the air. You might say, "I hear your point, but I'd like to finish my thought first." That sentence doesn't attack, it guides. And more often than not, people will adjust when they feel your steadiness. There's also a deeper layer here about trust in yourself. Many times, what makes interruptions so disruptive is that they rattle our confidence. You start wondering if your point was even strong enough, or if maybe they're right to cut in. That doubt is what keeps you from returning to your thought. But clarity is about trusting that your words matter enough to bring back, even if the moment feels awkward. Saying, "Let me circle back to where I was," might feel small, but it's actually a powerful act of self-respect. It shows you're not abandoning your own voice, even when the flow gets broken. And here's something else to consider: interruptions can reveal what the other person is really focused on. If they can't let you finish, it often means they're carrying something heavy on their end. A strong opinion, an assumption, or even insecurity. Instead of seeing it only as disrespect, you can use it as information. It tells you what matters most to them, and that can help you respond with more clarity. For example, if they interrupt to argue a detail, it shows you that detail is their sticking point. You can choose to address it directly, or you can decide it's not the hill worth climbing. Either way, you've gained insight you wouldn't have had if you'd only seen the interruption as an attack. The real power comes when you create clarity not just for yourself, but for the relationship. Imagine saying calmly, "When I get interrupted, it makes it hard for me to share fully. Can we try giving each other space to finish?" That's not blame, that's an invitation. You're naming the impact without shaming the person. And what that does is shift the conversation from a momentary clash to a long-term pattern that can be worked on. That's how respect is built, not in one perfect response, but in steady, repeated moments of calm boundary setting. Of course, not every interruption deserves a direct call out. Sometimes the wisest move is to let it go and return to your thought naturally without making it a battle. The key is knowing the difference. If the interruption was harmless or came from excitement, you can simply wait and then continue. As I was saying, if it's a repeated pattern that leaves you silenced, that's when you step in more clearly. Either way, you're not surrendering your space, you're choosing the path that keeps clarity alive instead of cluttering it with unnecessary conflict. And let's not ignore our own role. We've all interrupted someone before. We've all been guilty of jumping in too fast, finishing someone's sentence, or shifting the focus back to ourselves. Remembering that softens the way we respond when it happens to us. It keeps us from turning every interruption into proof that we don't matter, because sometimes it's not that deep. And giving others the same grace we hope they'll give us makes it easier to bring clarity instead of conflict. At the end of the day, interruptions are going to happen. People are imperfect. Conversations are messy, but those moments don't have to leave you powerless. Each interruption is a chance to steady yourself, reclaim your thought, and remind both you and them that your words carry weight. It's a chance to practice calm authority instead of falling into silence or shouting for space. And over time, those small choices build a bigger pattern, one where your voice is heard, your presence is felt, and clarity takes the place of confusion. Because clarity isn't about never being interrupted. It's about knowing that when it happens, you don't lose yourself. You can still guide the moment, you can still finish your thought, and you can still hold on to the respect you deserve. And when you do, you'll find that interruptions don't just disrupt, they can also reveal, reset, and remind you of the quiet strength you carry in your voice. There are few things more draining than a conversation that feels one-sided. You walk away not just tired, but smaller somehow, like you showed up fully, but the other person never really met you there. Maybe you've had this with a friend who talks endlessly about themselves, but never asks about you. Maybe it's with a partner who dominates the conversation, leaving no room for your thoughts. Or maybe it's at work where your ideas get passed over and you're left nodding along while everyone else takes the floor. In those moments, the problem isn't just about words. It's about the quiet message underneath. Your voice doesn't carry the same weight here, and if you're not careful, that message starts to chip away at your confidence. When conversations are one-sided, the danger isn't only frustration with the other person, it's what begins to happen inside of you. You start to wonder if your thoughts are worth sharing. You question whether your presence even makes a difference. Over time, you may find yourself talking less, offering less, shrinking back into the safety of silence. And while silence feels easier in the moment, it slowly erodes your sense of self. That's the hidden cost of one-sided conversations. They don't just wear on the relationship, they wear on your confidence. Protecting your confidence in those moments doesn't mean forcing your way into the conversation or demanding equal airtime. It's about reminding yourself that your worth isn't measured by how much room someone else gives you. Your voice matters whether or not they pause to hear it. And sometimes the first step is simply not internalizing their imbalance as a reflection of your value. When someone dominates the conversation, that's about them, their habits, their awareness, their need to be heard. It doesn't make your voice any less important. The challenge, of course, is that it still hurts. You can tell yourself it's not about you, but it still feels personal when your words go unnoticed. That's why protecting your confidence requires more than just mindset. It requires action. And that action often looks like setting subtle but firm boundaries in the way you engage. For example, if someone continually talks over you or takes up all the space, you can calmly say, "Let me finish my thought," or "I'd like to share my perspective here." Those words aren't aggressive, but they're clear. They reclaim your space without turning the moment into a fight. And every time you do that, you reinforce to yourself that your voice deserves to be in the room. Sometimes, though, the boundary is quieter. It's in how you choose to carry yourself when you're not being heard. If you keep lowering your energy to match the neglect, you teach yourself that your voice is conditional, that it only matters if someone else validates it. But if you keep your tone steady, your posture confident, and your words intentional, you protect that inner confidence regardless of their response. You're showing yourself that even if they're not listening, you still belong here. Another piece of this is learning to recognize patterns. If a conversation is one-sided once, it may just be circumstance. But if it's a consistent pattern, then it's revealing something deeper about the relationship. And here's where the responsibility comes in. You get to decide how much of yourself you keep offering to someone who refuses to meet you halfway. Protecting your confidence sometimes means adjusting your expectations. Maybe you stop looking for deep reciprocity in a relationship that's proven it can't give it. That's not bitterness, that's wisdom. Because your energy is precious, and pouring it into places that continually diminish you will only drain you further. But before you make those bigger decisions, there's power in naming the dynamic out loud. You might say, "I've noticed our conversations often feel one-sided, and I'd like us to work on making more space for both of us." That's not an attack, it's an observation. And sometimes people genuinely don't realize how they're showing up. They may adjust simply because you named it. But whether they change or not, the act of speaking it protects your confidence. It shows you that you can advocate for yourself, that you don't have to silently absorb imbalance as if it's normal. The truth is, conversations that feel one-sided often stir up old wounds. Maybe you grew up in a home where your voice was dismissed, where speaking up didn't change anything. Maybe past relationships taught you that your role was to listen and support, not to be heard yourself. That history makes one-sided conversations hit harder It's not just about this moment, it's about every moment where you felt unseen before. That's why protecting your confidence now is so important, because when you choose to hold on to your voice, you're breaking that old pattern. You're showing yourself that you no longer disappear when someone else takes over. And let's be real, protecting your confidence doesn't mean you'll always feel confident in the moment. Sometimes you'll still feel overlooked or frustrated or small. That's human. Confidence isn't the absence of those feelings. It's the decision to keep showing up anyway. It's the quiet act of saying, even if you don't make space for me, I will make space for myself. And each time you do, that confidence grows stronger. There's also a piece of empathy in this, because sometimes the people who make conversations one-sided aren't trying to diminish you. They're carrying their own need to be heard. They may be insecure, anxious, or unaware. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps you hold perspective. When you see their talking as a reflection of their need, not a dismissal of your worth, it's easier to stay steady. You don't absorb their imbalance as your identity. You recognize it for what it is, and you protect your confidence by not letting it define you. Over time, the way you handle these moments sets a tone. If you consistently hold your ground calmly, if you consistently bring your voice back into the conversation with clarity, people begin to see you differently. They may interrupt less, listen more, or adjust their patterns. But even if they don't, you'll know you've protected the most important thing: the belief that your words matter. That belief is what carries you through not just one conversation, but every conversation. So when you find yourself in another one-sided exchange, take a breath. Remember that you're not powerless. You don't have to either retreat into silence or explode in frustration. You can calmly bring yourself back into the moment. You can finish your thought. You can name the dynamic. You can choose to pour your words into spaces that value them. That's what protecting your confidence looks like. Because at the end of the day, confidence in conversation isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling yourself. It's about knowing that no matter how someone else shows up, you can still honor your own presence. And when you do that, one-sided conversations lose their power to shrink you. Instead, they become reminders of the strength you carry, the strength to stand steady, to speak calmly, and to believe in your voice, even when no one else makes room for it.